Thank you. The next slide. So the role of emotional labour. Again, we've seen it gives a language and a meaning to care. And it's a device for us to think about what emotions mean to us. And most important, it makes visible women's and others' caring work, a point which Paola has emphasized so strongly. And I love this quote: when we talk about caring for someone, we are talking about our emotions. Next slide, please. So, just some images here. Caring behaviors, what are they? They're smiling, they're friendly, they're kind, they're courteous. They involve rules. What are the rules in the environment we work? What is expected of us? How do we produce these emotions? Do we act, perform? And there's an emotional exchange. So can we have the next slide, please? I think it's important to think about this emotional exchange because it's really important to understand that it isn't just emotional, it's also financial. And that was the point of Arlie Hochschild in her work looking at the emotional labour of work, that it had a monetary value. Now, emotional labour varies with context, and we can see there that very different types of emotions and communications are going on between the nurses and the patients. One's unconscious, one's sitting at home. The next slide, please. So this takes me to my book, The Emotional Labour of Nursing. And these were the images that were very prominent in the 1990s. I wanted to show the diversity of the student body at that time, but also you see there a little girl with a teddy bear. There was a recruitment campaign at that time, which suggested that little girls could become very good nurses because they'd taken care of their teddy bears when they were children. So it was undervaluing the value of nursing and emotional labour and care. So I've already mentioned, I wanted to find out about the students who were apprentices at that time, working as part of the workforce, how they learnt to care. The next slide, Danny, thank you. And I've already said these things, but it was during the interviews with the students that I understood the sheer hard work that they engaged with. I could feel it, their own emotional labour, but it was the system that created barriers that sometimes stopped them caring. But then I found that it was the head nurse, the chef, enfermera chef, who was vital in setting the emotional tone of the caring and the learning environment. Next slide, please, Danny. So these are just some of the things that the students said. I think you can see there the student who, when the head nurse showed that she or he cared, then the student didn't feel that she had to take all that care on her own shoulders. Another student said, you can only learn in a caring climate. Another student who'd been on a ward where he'd found it very difficult said, fear isn't a good way to learn. It's much better if you have respect. Respect, that is the best, because you feel appreciated. And so that helps you to care. It's a very strong stimulus. Next slide, Danny. These are just some points made by patients. This was someone who was recovering from cancer, who said the nurses were such good listeners. It was so important he had active listening that helped him, that emotional side being helped to recover. Next slide, please. This was really what made me think about this emotional labor as a sort of act. This patient, he was a young man, he was actually a paramedic, so he had some insights. And he said, you know, you could see the nurses, they just keep coming, beck and call, always coming to the patient when they're ringing the bell. They might be very frustrated, have a lot to do, but when they come to the patient, they're all smiles. So we can see in this comment that at times the emotional labor can cost the nurse, but it makes the patient feel safe and cared for. Next slide, please. So, as Paula said and Danny has said, I revisited my book. There had been many changes in education and healthcare in the United Kingdom. So I collected new data, but compared it with my original research. Next slide. And so the big question was, can nurses still care? And if they do, how? So UK nurses are no longer apprentices, no longer in the workforce. 50% of time in practice and 50% in the university. They study for 3 or 4 years. The head nurses have much more management responsibilities, and the students have special mentors, but those mentors also care for patients. So sometimes there can be a conflict between the patient's needs and the student's learning needs. Next slide, please. The health service has changed. It's become, as has happened across the world, much more financially driven. And here was a nurse manager who said she was feeling very much as if she was just looking at patients as numbers. It frightened her. She had to stand back and remember that she was caring for people. So this is the emotional and the financial costs of emotion. Next slide, please. But those little things still matter, both to the student who can care for patients, listen to what they want to say, and students who can be made to feel welcome when they come to a new clinical placement. Next slide, please. So nurses still care, but there's enormous effort, skill, and organizational support required. And it's good, Paula, the work that you're doing that I think is really helping us to understand that effort, skill, and support required. Next slide, please.